She just shared that she had basically decided to end her life. And she actually shared that she had been saving up to buy a gun to do that. And yet she ended up at this show at Heavy and Light in San Diego, and for some reason things moved around inside of her, and she decided that night to stay alive. She changed her mind, and ended up having some really honest conversations as a result of that night, and just decided that she needed some help, that if she was going to stay alive, she couldn't do it alone, and that she was going to need to get some real help and start to let people in and start to let people know her. And I shared that with everyone, just before the show started, and we were really, really moved by that. And I say that to say that's the goal tonight, and that's the heart of the matter. And we know that everybody walks in here in the middle of a different story. For a lot of us, hopefully we walk in and things are okay, things are pretty good. But it's probably not a stretch to imagine that for some people life looks a bit different. Maybe it looks a bit heavier or a bit darker. And we hope that, like I said in the beginning, that tonight would be an encouragement, and that you would leave here feeling encouraged and feeling less alone. And we'll circle back to that. I want to talk just for a minute about how this night, how this tour came to be. And this whole thing started, this To Write Love on Our Arms thing started almost 7 years ago in Florida. And it started about as small as something could start. It began as an attempt to tell a story and an attempt to help a friend. And I had the privilege of meeting a girl named Renee in Orlando, and she became my friend and is my friend to this day. And when I met Renee, it was through a mutual friend, and Renee's life was in a really difficult place. She was in the middle of a season of depression, of drug addiction. We would later find out she had known this history of self-injury, and that she had attempted suicide more than once. She was denied entry into a treatment center in downtown Orlando, and my friends and I ended up spending the next 5 days with her, and I ended up writing a story about the conversations we had and the time that we shared together. And I felt like her life was filled with contrast. Her life was heavy and light. There was all this stuff that had happened to her that was really difficult, that had become this life of abuse and depression and addiction. And in the midst of that, she was this incredibly creative, gifted girl that had dreams of music and writing and communicating. And all of this was happening inside the same life and the same story. And that story that I wrote, it was called To Write Love on Our Arms. It somehow made its way around the world. And as the story started to find its way out, we realized maybe we could do more than just tell a story. Maybe we could try to help pay for Renee's treatment. Maybe we could play a part in this story. And so we had the idea to sell some t-shirts to do that. And then we had this other idea related to the internet. And in 2006, there was this thing happening. It was like an alternate universe. There was a top 8. There was a guy, Tom. He had a crappy default picture. And so this was the moment of MySpace. And in our timing, we were so lucky. A couple weeks later, the whole world was on MySpace. A couple years later, no one was on MySpace. And Justin Timberlake is trying to bring it back. He brought Sexy back. He is now bringing MySpace back. Yes. But joking aside, we just wondered, maybe we could help in a bigger way. Maybe this story could encourage people. Maybe it could even encourage people to get help. And really where things changed, a friend of mine was the first person to wear one of these t-shirts, and he wore it on stage at a Switchfoot show in South Florida. And so I was standing next to my friend John Foreman when we opened the first box of these t-shirts. And I told John just a little bit about Renee and her situation and this story, and he just said, "Man, this is great. Would it be okay if I wore this on stage?" And so I just kind of played it cool and just said, "Yeah, John, that'd be fine." And so he put on this black To Write Love on Our Arms t-shirt, and it just said those words on the outside in white. We didn't have a table set up. We didn't get to meet anyone or point them to the MySpace. It was just him wearing this t-shirt, and people found their way to the page. And late that night, I remember sitting down and checking the MySpace, if you remember that phrase as well. And wasn't expecting much, but was really blown away to find all these messages and comments and friend requests. And essentially what we found that night and what we found every day since then is that the story that Renee was living, the story that we began to tell, was a story that represented people all over the world. At first we'd hear from people wherever Switchfoot went, wherever Amber Lynn went, and these other bands that started to support us. And after a while it was Australia and the UK and Canada and all these different places. And people were saying, "Hey, that story you're telling, that's my dad. That's my girlfriend. That's a classmate. That's my neighbor. That's me." We heard from people who talked about what it was to live with the pain of losing a loved one to suicide. We heard from people who talked about what it was to live the daily struggle of depression. Some people used that word, other people didn't use that word. Some people talked about what it was to cope with pain through pain, and they talked about self-injury. People talked about, they wrote in on behalf of someone they cared about and said, I'm afraid I'm going to lose this person if they don't get help, but I don't know how to help them. Or I want to help, but when I try, it seems to just push them away. Do you have any advice? And so as you can imagine, we hear some heavy stuff. We have some heavy conversations, but the cool thing that I get to stand up here on behalf of is that we get to also see pieces of stories beginning to change. We get to see glimpses at stories that suggest that it's possible to change, that rescue and recovery and sobriety and freedom and healing, that these things are real and they can happen. And we hear from people who are now sitting across from a counselor for the first time, or they've stepped into treatment for the first time or the fifth or sixth time. And we hear from people who say, you know what, I'm doing this new life. I'm not doing it alone. It's not easy, but I'm believing that it's worth it. We hear from other people who are just stepping into community. Maybe they're just, for the first time, letting themselves be known and letting themselves be loved and being in relationships and friendships where that can happen. And maybe taking turns answering the question, how are you? Are you okay? And so all these things just give us hope and give us this excitement that, man, it's possible. And the thing we want to suggest tonight is that everybody in this room is living a story. And that your story matters just as much as everybody who's going to stand on this stage, everybody who's going to sing into a microphone. That you matter as much as them. And if all of us are living a story, it's probably true to say that all of us have parts of our story that we wish were different. We wish we could change, forget, erase, replace. And yet in the midst of that, we have these other things that make us feel alive. Maybe you heard Anise do a poem, or maybe you heard your favorite song tonight, and there's things that just make you light up. And maybe when you think about certain memories or relationships, places, films, books, or dreams for the future, maybe it's a career, maybe it's a place you want to live, it's having a family someday, that maybe in this life there's things worth staying alive for. And so that is our hope, is that you wouldn't hear from me or from any of us that's worth it. They're having a party at the bar. Okay? Our hope is that you wouldn't just take it, don't take my word, don't just hear it from the stage, but that in your life there would be people who remind you that your story matters. And there would be people who remind you that your story is worth fighting for, and that your story deserves other characters, that you shouldn't be alone inside of it. And we're not suggesting that any of this is simple or easy, but we're believing that you deserve to be healthy. We're believing that you deserve to be alive, to be okay, and to be known, not to be alone. And so I want to just pull this out. You got one of these on your way in. If you lost it, we have more at the merch table. But these look different every single night. And so tonight, what it looks like, it's resources, it's counseling, it's treatment options, it's crisis intervention here in Dallas and the surrounding areas. And there's a lot of people that have worked really hard to make this happen. So we don't want to just share this general message from stage and then say, hey, good luck. What we've done is the homework to say these are the places, these are the phone numbers, these are the websites, whether that's for you or whether that's for a friend. These are places and ways that you can get help. And so we hope whether it's tonight, whether it's tomorrow, maybe it's a month or a year from now, maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody you care about, that this could be a tool. And we would just absolutely love that. And that's the reason that everybody signed up for this tour, and that's really the heart of it. And now I have a really fun job of just introducing a friend of mine who is also one of my heroes. He is one of my favorite songwriters. And I think as we started dreaming about this tour and thinking about, we want this tour, these nights to kind of be at the intersection of pain and hope. And I feel like he's a guy who lives there, who writes songs there, who writes these songs that are incredibly honest, that ask questions. And one of my favorite people. If you guys would help me welcome John Foreman.
Well, thank you. Me too. Thank you. I'd like to start with a song that was written here in Dallas. Woo! Yeah, let's hear it for Dallas before we go any further. This was written in the parking lot.
Dallas loves
Parking
you!
lots in Dallas, y'all. And for me, there's a lot of places to look. Jamie was talking about Cure for Pain earlier. That's the title of this song. I'm not sure why it always goes down.